We should be recognising that instead of just calling people racist, we should be addressing why there is prejudice. That's not to say that everyone who is anti-immigration is racist, but it is to recognise that there is an element of racism and an element of prejudice within the anti-migrant feeling, and I think we need to be addressing that, trying to break down difference as opposed to reinforcing those differences, because people all over the world have far more in common than a lot of this discourse would have us believe.
You've written about the challenges, the cultural challenges. What would you say to Maya, what you've heard from Maya?
I entirely disagree. I think you would be hard-pushed to find a single country in the world that has been as tolerant and as welcoming of migration as this one. I cannot think of one anywhere in the world. I've travelled widely, not just on our continent, but across the world, and I can assure you that if the numbers that came into this country over the post-war period up to now had gone into any other country in the world, we would be seeing a very different response. And I think this is a knee-jerk assault on the British people, which is continuing and should stop. We were talking earlier about some of the economic implications. The economic implications of globalization include the possibility that people born in this country, at the same time as somebody in this country has a child, they are competing with dozens of other children around the world to get to the lifestyle benefits that people across the world would dream of and which people in this country think is their birthright. And that's changing. And that's going to change across all sorts of parts of the developed world. And one of the things that makes that change far, far more painful is the idea that it will happen simultaneously with an assault on their identity. Because people can potentially take the stagnation of wages, they can potentially take the living standards questions, but if at the same time you say, oh, and by the way, maybe we don't always say you're racist, but we sort of imply it, then I think you're going to build up a lot of problems for the future. And by the way, very quickly on your 1970s point, one of the things about migration is it takes a long time for that effect to happen. If you look at the opinion polls on migration in this country that followed the influx after the Blair government, it took time for people's attitudes to, as it were, harden on migration, precisely because the impact of that migration takes the time to happen. So as well as it were, misrepresenting the facts, I think you just have to be extremely careful not to say, this country, which is, as I say, the most tolerant country in the world, is in fact the most bigoted, because if you travel anywhere around the world, you will see a very different picture.
I would just like, I think Douglas makes a very important point there. This point about tolerance is part, as far as I'm concerned, part of the problem. For decades, people have been told to put up with people, and there's never been a concerted explanation to demystify difference. So people have been told, put up with that person living down the street. They're different from you, they've come from a different country, maybe they cook a different cuisine. Put up with them.
What if they have? Can I ask you something? Because this comes to the heart of what so many people are debating at the moment, and it's actually at the heart of Douglas's book, and we'll get his response to it in a moment. What if they have a fundamentally different set of values, social values? Because we've come through, well, it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation this year. We've had that, we've had the Enlightenment, we've had the Age of Reason. It's been a long road to where we are today for our, broadly speaking, liberal values. What if people are inimical to those? So
firstly, we need to look at the fact that the history of Britain is one of my people coming in and out of the country. So this idea that values exist in this kind of hermetically sealed unit of the nation state quite clearly isn't true. If you look at David Olusoga's Black Britain, you'll see that over 2,000 years, people have been coming in and out of this country, contributing ideas and to social change. And what I would like to be answered on this question of social values, what are the social values? What are the social values that we feel are at risk by migration? Let's pinpoint them particularly because this is consistently talked about from the right, and it's never quite clear.
I can do. Firstly, on your point about the constant movement, actually, the movement into these islands in particular has been really minimal over what was the biggest event over the last millennia? The Norman Conquest. About a 5% population shift as a cause of the Norman Conquest. So this idea that, as it were, the movement has been perennial. Also, the movement that you're talking about most of the time is movement from France with the Huguenots, for instance, Protestant French people, or movement from Ireland into what we now call mainland Britain. That is not the same as somebody from Eritrea or Ghana or Myanmar moving in to live in Salford. It's a totally different movement, and you should would admit that.
What's so different about people from Eritrea, Myanmar and
My God,
please
you
tell me
can't have gone anywhere.
Specifically.
You can't have gone anywhere. If you honestly have to answer that question. It is a simple
statement of
the obvious that countries and cultures have differences.
What
it doesn't mean
specifically what are the cultural specificities?
Okay, I'll give you the history lesson. This country has, throughout most of its history, been for instance, a Christian country. It has been, I'm not a practicing Christian myself, but it has been historically a Christian country. It's been particularly a Protestant Christian country.
I mean,
with views, if I may just finish, you see, you ask me to define something, and then I try, and then you talk. You have institutions that, for instance, epitomise the country. In this country, the institutions that epitomised our country were an established monarchy, for instance, the establishment of Parliament, the establishment of the judiciary and of the law courts, the establishment of the great educational institutions. A whole set, I could go on and on. Now, see, one of the problems is, whenever people say, well, what is this thing that you call Britain? We have an identity. It's forever being put on a psychiatrist's couch now and being deconstructed. But we have an identity just as other people have an identity. We don't have to war or hate each other, but we should recognise it exists.
OK, Myra, we'll come back to you. Just hold...
The change has been so radical and rapid.
Well, we can't ignore that. And to come back to Douglas's point originally, which I think we need to probe more, is this idea that...
Probe away.
Is that this idea that British society, he listed the monarchy, he listed Parliament, that is somehow under threat from people from Eritrea, Ghana and Myanmar. That's not clear to me how that's the case. You've listed all these institutions, but you haven't really explained exactly what it is that is under threat from these people. From the
a quick answer from Douglas, because he has to answer that, because he's had a direct... He's had a direct challenge there, and then Sam, I'm going to come to you, and Linda, I'm going to go Linda first, then Sam, but Douglas, answer that direct challenge from Maya.
You can do it on all sorts of things. You can do it on historical attitudes, or you can do it on, for instance, current social attitudes, which is, I'll throw out as one example. And take an example that Nikki just cited of tolerance. I think we agree in Britain that we're a tolerant country, we're meant to be a tolerant country, we try to be a tolerant country, and so on. There's been polling in recent years that actually shows that the more immigration you have, the less tolerance you have on certain issues, not because we, the British people, have become intolerant, but because people come with views of their own. Let me give you a very quick example. A poll carried out 2 years ago by YouGov asked people their opinions on homosexuality, morally acceptable or morally not acceptable. Across the country as a whole, about 14% of the British people said homosexuality not morally acceptable. In London, it was double that. Why would that be? Is it because London, the capital city, is just a particular home of homophobia? Or might it be, as I would suggest it is, because people come into the country with attitudes of their own? And you may deprecate that, and I deprecate that, but we should at least acknowledge it, and you're trying to cover it over.
No, I think that actually, this poll, what's actually, there's another poll that shows actually, and asks about attitudes towards homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and you actually find, apart from Scotland, in one of the questions, London has better attitudes towards homosexuality than the rest of the other regions in the country.
They could be evangelical Christian, they could be certain Muslim communities. You know that attitudes are harder on that. That is
but the point, my point is that Douglas is citing this poll, but there's counter-evidence to that. And I just want to make a broader point that, yes, there are some attitudes that I don't agree with, such as homophobia. I think that we should be challenging those, because if you go back to the late 1980s, even Margaret Thatcher was saying that our children were being taught traditional moral values, were also being taught that they had an inalienable right to be gay. And that led to the Section 28. So the point is, social attitudes do change, and you should be encouraging them to change.
Wait a minute, OK. People like Douglas has been
the other thing is, just quickly, that the corporations and things, they're not entities that are impossible to affect. And I was speaking to somebody from Silicon Valley recently, one of the big tech firms there, who's saying, the way in which they've developed politically, for instance, I mean, these are corporations with more money than a lot of countries, but the way they've developed in their idea of politics is sort of teenage. I mean, they say they've grown so fast that, their sort of hands have gone a bit faster than their legs have extended and so on. These are entities which are profoundly available to be influenced by politics, by public sentiment, by public mood. They are far more vulnerable to all of these things than we think, I think.
People power.
You didn't, frankly, have the balls to put country before party.